Recording now.
Just hold on a sec.
Well, I should introduce you first, Tony.
Okay.
No, let's disregard all of the stress of the nefarious forces preventing us from being able to see you this evening, the gremlins.
Jolly old archons.
Jolly old archons. So this is somewhat of a theme for mine and Tony's working life together. We present Consciousness Hour together. Tony asked me to help him be involved in his very regular talk show host. How many shows have you done now with Consciousness Hour? It must be hundreds.
Yeah, around about 150, I think, something like that, if not more.
So during the course of that, and just my very brief involvement with it so far, like, we have interviewed some amazing people together, and it's been absolutely fascinating. I've got to know loads of people and made lots of new friends. So Anthony is an author who I'm sure many of you will be aware of his work and read his books, who specializes in the science and history and sort of cultural phenomenons of near-death experiences, perceptions of the afterlife, all kinds of transcendental experiences and parapsychological events as well. So this is going to be a very interesting presentation, I'm sure. And we're continuing really on the theme of death and dreaming, as we were joined by Gregory Shushan and Pascal Michael yesterday, talking about the history and culture of near-death experiences and divine dreaming. Anthony's going to be looking at the myths in Greek culture that look at the afterlife and the journey of the soul after death. So Tony, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you very much for everyone coming along, and I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, right. I've been really looking forward to this. I wish I was in Athens. I've spent so much time of my life in Athens. I usually end up there at least once or twice a year. But unfortunately, I'm now sitting in what is a slightly grayer UK. But nevertheless, let's give it a start. Okay, what I'll be talking about here is the material that I presented in my latest book, my 2022 book, Cheating the Ferryman. This is an expansion on a book I first wrote back in 2001, which was eventually picked up by a publisher and published in 2006. That first book has now sold around about 90,000 copies, somewhere in that region worldwide, has been translated into many foreign languages as well, which is really interesting. But this is going to be a new presentation. I've never really done this one before because I've very much Grecified it. And I'm very much focusing in on the elements of ancient Greek myths in terms of my writings. Right, so the beginning, iarchi. What do I mean by this? Well, the beginning of everything, the beginning of life, the time that we come into existence from wherever we come from, wherever that location is. You know, as one person once said, I can't remember, it was an American witty guy. It might have been Mark Twain, but he turned around and he said, I don't fear death because for millions of years I haven't existed anyway, so therefore what does it matter? Well, in many ways it does, because we come from somewhere. And the Greeks very much have these ideas of the idea of ethos, anthropy, daemon, and the idea that we have different levels and shades to our consciousness. And these are related, and we know about these from the Greek myths and everything else as well. So let's go right back to Plato in the Republic 10, where he said, when all the souls have chosen their lives, they went before Laxis, and she sent with each, as the guardian of his life and the fulfiller of his choice, the daemon that he had chosen. So the idea is the ancient Greeks believed that before you were born, you chose a spirit that would be with you for your life and would guide you throughout your life. This spirit was known as the daemon. And the idea of the concept of the daemon is something that goes not quite straight through Greek myths, but in most cultures around the world. And when I wrote my book, The Daemon: A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, which was the sequel to to Is There Life After Death, the first book, The Daemon came out in 2008. I was surprised to discover just how common this concept is, the idea that we have a higher self, a tutelary spirit that follows us through our lives. And in fact, here's some examples. In ancient Egyptian, you had the Ka and the Ba. In Persian, the Irvan and the Dana. And in Chinese, the Hun and the Po. Now, what I found particularly interesting was the Kalabari, who are, I think, a tribe in, I think I'm right in saying it's southern Nigeria. And they have a concept called the Biangbo and the Time. And they argue that the Biangbo, again, is given to them at birth, and it guides you through life. And they believe it guides you through life because it's lived your life before. And you've lived your life many, many times. And this is the guiding force through your life and how it guides you. And of course, the ancient Greek, the pre-Socratics, had the concept of the thymos and the psyche. But let's look a little bit, firstly, at evidence that maybe we are more than one individual, and that part of us seems to have greater knowledge. Now, when I do my greater presentations, I have a series of around about 15 examples from writers and poets and artists, from Jean Cocteau through to this gentleman here, Rudyard Kipling, about what happened during their lives that made them believe that there was more than one they had more than one personality. Now, Kipling was a fascinating guy. And although he's not quite as in vogue as he used to be, some of his stories are quite fascinating. And not only that, but in his autobiography, which was called Something of Me, he describes quite precisely where his art came from and where his writing came from. And he said that what you need to do is wait for your daemon to come. And your daemon will guide you if you're an artist or a painter or a writer. And he described once how he was walking in the gardens of Bateman's, which is his house in East Sussex. Lovely, lovely location if you get the chance to go there. And he had a particular problem because he had written a short story called The Old Men of Pevensey. And this short story ended up in an anthology of short stories called, I think it was Pooke's Corner. But in The Old Men of Pevensey, like many writers do, and I'm sure if any of you have ever written things, you know how this happens, is that if you're writing a fictional story, sometimes you get yourself into an impasse where you develop the characters and then you place them in a position or a location that is problematic. And in this particular story, Kipling had two elderly gentlemen who were living down in Pevensey on the Channel coast in 1066 at the time of the Norman invasions. And they were located in Pevensey Castle. And they particularly were trapped inside one of the round towers in Pevensey Castle. And he'd placed them at the top level of one of the round towers, and they were surrounded by French Norman troops. And he needed to get them out. And he didn't know how to continue the story. So he goes for a walk in the gardens of Bateman's, and his daemon comes to him. And he explains this in his autobiography. And the daemon turns around, he said, "You've got yourself in a problem, haven't you?" And it seemed he had an inner dialogue with this entity. And he turned round and the daemon said, "I think I've got a solution for you." And Kipling said, "Okay, what is that?" And the daemon said, "How about you place a sea well inside the tower?" Because this is a modern photograph of Pevensey Castle, but it used to have a moat all the way around it. It was right on the coast. So it was in the position that, hold on a minute, we're getting games here again. Just hold on. Okay, we'll go back to this. So it said, say there's a seawall and you can actually go down, you'll find a place where you can get into the seawell and you can go down into the moat and you can escape. And he turned around and he said, "But this is ridiculous. He said, there is no sea, there is no place like that within Pevensey Castle. But he said, I'll write the story anyway. And he stopped the impasse and he continued the story. And he had the old men climb down the sea well, get into the moat and sail off, and they escape. What he says in his autobiography is that around about 15 or 20 years later, there were excavations done in Pevensey Castle. And they found the sea well in the tower that the daemon said it would be. And as Kipling said, how did my daemon know this? Nobody knew there was this location there. And subsequently, he also wrote a short story, which I'll just touch on very quickly, called On the Wall, which was a group of Roman soldiers up on Hadrian's Wall. And in it, in the story, again, the daemon has him describe a particular form of killing arrows that the Romans had only ever used in Italy. But he decided that for the story's purposes, he needed these killing arrows used up on the wall in Hadrian's Wall. And lo and behold, many years later again, they actually, excavations discovered the killing arrows that he described in the book. And as he said, what is it about the daemon that seems to know my future? It seems to have information that it will gain in the future, which it then back creates to actually create my stories. Now, again, in my writings, I have literally scores of examples of this from writers like Philip K. Dick to A.E. Housman and various other people. But this is intriguing. So how does the daemon do this? Well, let's move from the beginning to totelos, the end, because this is where I think things start to get very interesting. Many of you will know of a concept called the near-death experience. And in the near-death experience, there are many things that people say happen when they're close to death, or they are in a dangerous situation where they're going to die, or they've had cardiac arrest. Now, many of the things that people describe here are quite extraordinary. They describe certain things like time slows down. They describe they meet with beings of light, but they also have something they call the panoramic life review. This is the classic idea of my life flashed in front of my eyes. So what do they mean by this? Well, I'd like to argue that something very, very strange happens at the point of death in terms of the workings of the brain. And what I believe happens is that the pineal gland releases a substance, a hallucinogenic substance called dimethyltryptamine. And I argue in my books that there is growing evidence that dimethyltryptamine may be synthesized in the brain. And not only that, it might be synthesized by the pineal gland. Okay. So how does it link then to Greek legend? Okay. Well, do you remember, if you go back into the Greek past, when somebody died in ancient Greek times, they would paste a little coin called an obolus, or 2 oboli. If they used 1 obolus, they'd place it underneath the tongue of the corpse. And if they would place 2 of them over the eyes of the corpse. And they had a reason for this. Because by having the obolus, when the dead person found themselves on the banks of the Styx, Charon the boatman would appear. And the person would be able to pay the shade, that is the dead person, the soul, would be able to pay the ferryman to take them over to the land of the dead. When they got over to the land of the dead, legend has it that they would suffer from amnesia. And the amnesia was brought about by drinking the waters of one of the tributaries of the river Styx, the river Lethe, the river of forgetting. And the idea was that when you were in the land of the dead, you'd be given a choice. You could either go forward into the land of the dead and remain there, or you could drink the waters of the river Lethe, have all your memories wiped clean, and go back. and live your life again with no memories of your previous life. So you would go back to your life and be reborn again with no memories of the life you'd led before. You'd be in a state of amnesia. Now, this, of course, is legend. But I believe that all legends and all myths, as the word myth means, there's a truth there, there's a story being told. And I believe what actually takes place at the point of death, or there's growing evidence, and it's evidence that I present in all my books, and particularly my latest book, Cheating the Ferryman, is that we cheat the ferryman. We never pay him the oboli. And this is the process that I believe takes place. Here we have a skydiver. And this skydiver has made a great error. He's forgotten his parachute. So as he starts to fall towards the ground, there's going to be a point where he's just about to hit the ground. Now, I believe that what happens, this is in a period of great stress. Now, there's growing evidence that in the periods of great stress, the brain releases very quickly particular neurotransmitters in the brain. And my model used to very much argue the release was a substance called glutamate, which is the major neurotransmitter of the mammalian brain. And we know certain things about glutamate when it floods, because it causes time to slow down. Subjective time starts to slow down when this takes place. Now, I also argue, I think, that DMT is released in the brain at that time as well. In times of great stress, the brain, the pineal gland, releases DMT via probably and glutamate as well. So if that is the case, and this person is falling towards the ground, and suddenly, as is reported in near-death experiences and in times of stress, the time slows down. And I will guarantee there are an awful lot of you out there that have had this experience when suddenly you feel that you're in a state of danger and suddenly everything slows down. Now, if this is the case, and this is what happens at the point of death, if you start looking at this objectively, you realize that if time slows down and every second or millisecond takes twice as long as the one that's gone before, you will quickly realize that this person's never going to hit the ground. As far as he is concerned, in his own bifurcation of time, he's never going to die. But for a witness standing next to him, he sees him hit the ground because he's in a different time scale. Now, again, if anybody's interested in the arguments for this, I wrote a book called The Labyrinth of Time, where I discuss this in great detail, what this really means. So we have then this curious set of circumstances whereby we're trapped in this kind of time scale. And what I argue is, and again, I do the science of this, and I do the neurology of this, and I take people back to things like split brain operations and just the evidence. And what I argue is that at the point of death, consciousness splits into two distinct personalities, the daemon and the eidolon. These are again terms from ancient Greek, and they're also terms used by the Gnostics. And I argue what happens is when consciousness splits, the daemon becomes self-aware. The daemon has been in your life as a kind of a background, and it's not aware of its own independence until your first death. And then suddenly it becomes aware of the fact that it's you, your universal you, your immortal you. Now, this could explain something called the panoramic life review, in that people claim that my life flashed before my eyes. Now, I argue that in a near-death experience, the life does flash in front of your eyes. Because imagine a scenario that the daemon, and I think the daemon is responsible for the panoramic life review, imagine the daemon suddenly realizes that what it has to do is draw up the recording of your lives. And I'll try and explain later what I mean by all the recordings. But what it does is it realizes that you're not actually going to die. So it metaphorically presses the fast forward of the video of your life. So the dying person in a near-death experience literally sees their life flash before their eyes, or they see a series of images of their life. This is because the daemon is wanting to get through because it realizes you're not going to die. But from that moment onwards, the daemon knows, the daemon is sort of independent of you and exists within you. So individuals, when they have near-death experiences, feel they've changed. They feel they are different. And in my latest book on near-death experiences, this is what I'll be discussing. And they feel different because the daemon is more imminent in your life. And you have access to what I call demonic consciousness. And I'll try and explain what I mean by demonic consciousness in a second. So this could explain certain things, because what happens is in that final moment of your death, and remember you're in this internal time, what happens is you go back to your birth and you start to relive your life again in a literal minute by minute recreation of your life. Now, I don't have the time to do the science here, but effectively what I argue is that we are living and existing in a simulation, or an instantation, as Andrew Gallimore calls it, Dr. Andrew Gallimore. And what I argue is that we are living in a computer game of our lives, that every outcome of every decision that we can make is already encoded within the game. And this encoding is in what's something called the 0 point field, or the Akashic record, or the Akashic field, as my associate Irvin Laszlo calls it. And everything that can happen is recorded in there and will happen somewhere. It's again an application of Everett's many worlds interpretation, the top-down hypothesis of Stephen Hawking, and various other top scientific writers. Now, again, if you don't necessarily want to take my word for this, just how serious science is now taking this, if you go online and you do a search on YouTube for something called the quantum suicide thought experiment, which was something put forward by Professor Max Tegmark, a cosmologist at the University of Princeton. And he argues, using quantum mechanics, that you can prove that you will never die. This is using quantum mechanics. This is not the loon ball down the pub, nor is it indeed Anthony Peake necessarily saying it. Serious scientists are saying that, if you do the application of quantum mechanics, the implications are that we all may be immortal. So what then happens? Well, what I argue is that the Eidolon lives in linear time, in the sense that it progresses through life and it grows old. And at the end of that second life, the same thing happens again. It then has another near-death experience, and it goes back and lives another life and another life. Whereas the daemon knows of all your life. It's existing in what's called the long body, or the linga sharia, the long body. And the idea is it knows your future. And in its memories, sometimes they link over to Eidolonic memory. Have you ever had that sensation? You have been somewhere, or you're speaking to somebody and suddenly you go, I've done this before. You know it as deja vu. The more correct term is deja vu. It's evidence that you've already lived. It is exactly what it feels like. You have a memory of living your life again. So that's the cheating the ferryman. And this again is trying to explain how this time model works. And again, I'm going back to Greek philosophy and Zeno's paradox. And you remember, Zeno's paradox is a race between Achilles and a tortoise. And it's a 100-yard race. And because the tortoise is slow, Achilles gives the tortoise a 50-yard start. So the tortoise is already halfway down the track to the end. And when the race starts, the tortoise starts moving, and so does Achilles. By the time Achilles gets to the point that the tortoise was, the tortoise will have moved on. So Achilles has to run another distance to get to where the tortoise is. But by that time, the tortoise has already moved on again. Now, this is called Zeno's bisection paradox. And Zeno proved effectively that Achilles will never ever catch the tortoise. A guy called Thomson applied this to time, and he did an experiment called Thomson's lamp, where he proved that effectively within time, if time can be infinitely bisected, and if we all perceive time subjectively, then within our own time scale, we will never get to the point of death, using the same argument I used earlier on. So the idea is we live in smaller and smaller pieces of subjective time, and in doing so, we may, in fact, live forever. And of course, Plato said this. He said that a daemon of each person, which is allocated to him while living, undertakes to lead each to a certain place where it is necessary that all of them, being collected together after they have been judged, should proceed to Hades, together with their leader, who is ordered to conduct them from hence thither. For he says that a simple path leads to Hades, but it appears to me that the path is neither simple nor one, for there would be no occasion of leaders, nor could anyone ever wander from the right road, if there was but one way. But now it appears we have many divisions and dubious turnings, and this, I conjecture, is our holy and legal rights. And effectively what he's talking about here is the idea that there are more than one paths through life. And that one of the few paths, and the way in which we do this, is something called aeonia epistrophe, which means the eternal return or the eternal recurrence. The idea that we go back and we live our lives over and over again. But it's not a circle, it's a spiral, if that makes sense. And of course, this idea of the spirals of life is not just in Greek mythology. In Buddhism, they have a concept called the Kala Chakra, time cycles. In Islam, before the point of death, they have a concept called Barzakh. And as Rumi said, it is to die before you die. And of course, in Christianity, they have the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. And of course, the Stoics believed that we will live this life many, many times. And of course, we have it in modern fiction. In the play by J.B. Priestley, I Have Been Here Before, there's a character who goes back in time, who's lived his life many, many times to help others. You have The Strange Life of Ivan Osokin by Peter Ouspensky, the Russian philosopher, where a young man is given the opportunity to relive the years from the ages of 18 to 23. He makes the same mistakes he made as he did last time. And of course, we have the classic eternal return, eternal recurrence. Groundhog Day, the Bill Murray movie. Whereas you know from Groundhog Day, what happens is Bill Murray lives the Groundhog Day over and over again. But for him, each day is different. Although he's in an eternal recurrence, he's not trapped. He's not living the same life. He can change. And his daemon effectively, through him, changes every day. If you recall in the film, that's exactly what he does. He changes every day. And I have interviewed the guy who wrote the screenplay of it. And he's in agreement. In fact, you'd be interested to know that Danny Rubin, who was the guy that wrote the screenplay, who's a lecturer at Harvard, when he came across my first book, he actually gave my book to various friends of his, because he said, this guy's done the science of Groundhog Day. So we are in this garden of forking paths. We are in this world where there are multiple paths we can follow, because we're all existing in a digital world that everything that can happen will happen. We just, in technical terms, we collapse the wave function of the particular reality that our daemon wants us to go within. It's like you're in a third-person computer game. You recall in computer games what happens when a person plays a computer game and the on-screen sprite starts at the beginning of the game, you know, like for my generation, Lara Croft, and you're the game player and you tell Lara to go down into a room. She goes in there and she gets killed by a monster. That Lara Croft is an Eidolon and it's dead. It dies, it lives once and it dies. But this time round, the game player, i.e. the daemon, knows a little bit about the environment, the Lara Croft's life and her environment. So this time round, on the second life, it doesn't have a go in that room. And through each iteration and each life, the daemon gets to know more about your life. And over thousands of lives, it then lives the perfect life, like Connors does in Groundhog Day, where he's allowed to move on to the next day, because he's starting doing good for doing good's sake. And this is what we are here to do, in my argument, is that we are here to live the best life we possibly can by caring for others. And if that takes thousands of lives, it takes thousands of lives to do so. Because remember, within the game, not only all the outcomes of your decisions are programmed within the game, but also the outcomes of all the decisions that your ancestors made. Your parents made decisions which had direct influence upon your life. You could have been born in Australia. Your parents could have decided to emigrate to Terra del Fuego. You could have been brought up there. In fact, again, as Brian Cox and Jeff Forshaw in their book of the same title say, anything that can happen will happen. Again, this is science. And of course, we have the theme of rivers here. And Heraclitus, the Roman philosopher, said, no man's ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man. And so it is, we never do. And of course, the ancient Greeks were also aware of the simulation, the idea that the world we live in is not what it seems. And again, Plato was the person that came upon the concept of Plato's cave. And Sarah and I and a few of our friends, we did an event at Dracolo Tunnels in 2019, in April 2019, where we recreated Plato's cave. And we have an intention of trying to recreate Plato's cave in Greece, because I know the location of it as well, where they think that Plato's cave originally was. And we still have a plan to try and do this. But just to explain Plato's cave as a concept, there's a group of prisoners who have lived all their lives tied down next to a wall, looking at the back wall of a cave. They can only move their heads to look at the back wall. They cannot move in any other way. And what happens is there is a fire behind them. And there is a group of people who occasionally walk around the back of the wall with cardboard cutouts. And those cutouts are reflected on the wall of the cave. And this is what the prisoners believe is reality, because they don't know anything better. But one day, one of the prisoners manages to escape, goes past the wall and goes up to the entrance and pokes his head out the entrance, as you can see here, to realize what the real world is like. And he goes back to tell his fellow prisoners, and they don't believe him. This is because he's realized demonic consciousness. He's realized that what we exist in is a facsimile universe. It's a program. It's what the Hindus call Maya. We think it's real. And in my books and in my lectures, I explain exactly how this works neurologically, how we create an inner creation. In the brain creates a model inside our heads of the external world. What you're perceiving now is not what is out there. If you believe there's a one-to-one relationship with what you are perceiving and what is out there, you are called a naive realist by perception scientists, because that's naive realism. That's not what's out there. Whatever is out there, it's not what we think it is. And we are more and more coming to discover now the nature of reality is digital. It's made up of binary code, and it is all to do with black holes. And again, I do not have time to discuss this, but in my other talks, I discuss exactly how it may be that the simulation itself works. Right, everybody, that is my talk. So I hope I didn't ramble too much, and I hope that I didn't take the chance. Now, I don't know how I can get you guys back here. Maybe
there
if I go.
seems to be 2 extra Anthony Peakes in the waiting room, which is quite interesting. I wonder what would happen if I let them 2 in.
I think they're my daemon. They're my daemon. No, they will be my daemon.
I'm going to see what happens when I let them in.
And my uber daemon.
Thank you so much, Tony. Tony, if we're living in a simulation, if we're living in a computer program, who's the programmer?
The programmer, there's an interesting argument put forward that the programmers are our own future selves. There is an argument to say, I think it was Nick Bostrom, who is a philosopher at Cambridge. And he argues that the evidence is that if our ability to make computer programming more complex and being able to get more and more information together, it will mean that supercomputers will be developed by our descendants. Now, these supercomputers will be so powerful that they can simulate, as we can already do with things like Second Life. What would they do with all this processing power? Well, they'd probably create ancestor sims. And if they created ancestor sims, they'd place ancestors in them. They'd place their own ancestors in them. And then they'd populate it with possibly sentient sprites who they will watch and observe, just like people do with The Sims. And that we're in that at the moment. Now, his argument...
wars that are going on, it's feeling very Sims-like at the moment, isn't it? There's something very strange and Sims-like about big wars and catastrophes like this, where there seems to be this like utter disregard for human life one moment, and then if you look at something like the COVID situation, this preciousness and desperateness about preserving human life. It's a really interesting and strange time that we're living in at the moment.
It is, and it gets stranger and stranger, I think. I don't know quite what is happening. But then again, there is the argument to say, can you still hear me, by the way?
Yeah.
Oh, good. There's an argument to say that all civilizations always think that they are the pinnacle, they're the end times, that they're witnessing something special and something extraordinary. So, it's very much from our privileged position. But it does seem that things are now coming to a head. Again, using the term telos, as in Greek, teleology, the end. It's the idea that something's coming together. There's something in the air. And could it be that it's the discovery of our own daemons? Could it be that what we will realize is that we'll break through the simulation, we'll break through the matrix in some way and discover what we really are?
That reminds me a bit of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's idea of humanity moving towards the omega point, and this kind of unifying force whereby information has mass, and actually we're moving towards like pure unity, I guess. That's his idea, really, isn't it?
Well, Chardin was a fascinating thinker, and yes, his idea of the way in which we are developing and everything else as well is indeed fascinating, and it makes a good deal of sense. Chardin was a great thinker, and his omega point just makes sense. But this is ultimately teleological. It is ultimately the idea that there is and always has been some form of plan, and we're following it. But then again, if you take the something called the cosmic anthropic principle, suggests that the universe has been programmed from the first moments of the Big Bang for the evolution of consciousness. And there's a counter argument to say, and the reason that is that consciousness is needed to bring the universe into existence, and that in many ways we are all tools by which the universe is making itself self-aware. And these are extraordinary ideas, because of course we have the concept of the Or Ein Sof within the Kabbalah, which is the idea that we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, and it's us becoming aware of that. And of course it's the famous Bill Hicks monologue, isn't it, as well? So it's all very intriguing. Whether anything I'm saying now is true, I have no idea. All I would say is that from my decades of research into so many areas of human understanding, This is what it is telling me. This is what it's pointing towards. This is what my daemon is pointing towards.
Well, you certainly say it very passionately, Tony. So that's good. I was thinking about, what you were talking about programming wise, and that makes me think a little of like Alan Turing's idea of morphogenesis, for example, which is what he was working on before he died, which is this idea, I guess, of a kind of immaterial blueprint that governs the way life forms develop. And that's an idea that I think Rupert Sheldrake kind of developed into this idea of morphic resonance as well. So how do you feel about the relationship or the differences between programming, as you're describing it in terms of binary code and a digital program, and morphogenesis and morphic resonance?
I think there's great similarities here, and I think there's great resonance, to use the term, between the two of them. Because when we use the terminology of programming and computers, we need to not get trapped into the idea that we're talking about necessarily things even physical. A computer is anything that can process information, however that works. Now, there's recent evidence that that information has mass. This is the point you were saying earlier on. So in which case, if information has mass, then it has physical presence in some way. And you can then start to realize how information can then build the world we see around us. Now, there were a group of researchers, and I think they're still there under the auspices of a guy called Craig Hogan at the Perimeter Institute in Sudbury, Ontario, in Canada. And they're looking for the pixelation of space. They believe that space is pixelated. Not only this, they believe that time is also pixelated as well. Time itself, they've been looking for many years for the subatomic particle of time, which has been jokingly called the chronon. And if this is the case, if time is quantized, it even means that time is in bits. So even our illusion of movement is created by the brain. There is no movement. There is no, going back to Heraclitus, there is no time. There is no flow of time. The river of time does not flow. And it's one of the things I said a few years ago, was that if you think about it, we say that time flows like a river. But if it is, what's it flowing against? The only reason I know that a river is flowing and moving is because I can see the riverbanks. If there were no riverbanks, how could I know that time was flowing? And does time flow around me, or do I flow through it? And if there are different times, the only time that you can measure time against is another form of time, because time is the only thing I know that's measured by itself. It's not, you can have a minute or an hour of an hour, but you can have a pound of apples. So in which case time itself is a huge mystery, and it's mind created. As Einstein once said, time is an illusion, but it's a very, very persistent one.
Well, it's interesting, this idea of time perception. And one of our next guests is going to be Eric Wargo, who wrote Time Loops, and he's going to be doing a workshop on precognitive dreaming and time loops. And I think for me, it's something that I find very interesting in regard to considering ancient cultures, because you can see in the ideas and in the literary texts and in the cultures in the ancient world that time is perceived differently, and perceiving time differently completely colors the way that you experience the world. Because if you can appreciate that your personal time is connected to the cyclical circles of time in nature, to cosmic motions, and to a sort of lineage through your ancestry, then you have a very different perception of time. And I think that something similar can be said about perhaps ancient perceptions of scale. Like, I'm sure, because it's something that I witness in dreams, this difference in time perception, and how flexible time perception can be. Like, everyone knows that children have a sort of different perception of time than adults. They'll spend like an hour playing in a puddle, and they don't have this sense that they have to be somewhere. And the way that we've constructed our world has parceled time up so that we feel like we're wasting time, or we have to get from one time to another time. We're on the clock quite often. So it's interesting for me to think about how time perception affects consciousness and the way that we perceive our world. And with regards to scale, something else I've noticed about dreaming is there isn't this kind of hierarchy of scale. And what happens in dreams is the more you're giving something your attention, the bigger and the more detailed it becomes, which is quite interesting, and goes to show that there's this flexibility of perception that can persist like beyond sleeping and be present in the waking world quite often as well. And one other thing I was going to say on the subject of things like creation myths and ways of trying to make sense of the universe is they do seem to be quite culturally dependent, because if you look back into ancient cultures, when the media, the material was something like clay, for example, humanity were created on a potter's wheel. When we started to use different forms of technology, or when we developed writing, words were something that were delivered to human beings by the gods, and the world is written into being. So it's interesting that now philosophers are discussing this idea that we're living in a computer simulation, and it makes me wonder what might be next on the agenda in terms of ways of viewing the world with technology that we don't know and isn't in existence yet.
Well, this is the very good point, isn't it? How it is that the point I was trying to make, not very effectively earlier on, was that we define the world from our understanding of the world, and we define it via our technologies and our understanding. But there are technologies that we have no idea may exist. I mean, I used to use the idea of if somebody, in the 18th century saw a CD-ROM, they would think it's a mirror or it's something else. They wouldn't in any possible way think that there's any information on there. And it's the same. We may have things all around us that we are not aware contain information, because it's just we don't have the understanding and worldview to bring that information out. And it's like perception. You perceive more because you're anticipating it. I have a concept, as you know, called the egregorial, the idea that because we anticipate things, they come into existence. I anticipate that my computer system is not going to work when I do Zoom, and lo and behold, it doesn't. And I know I'm being slightly facetious there, but it's a point. There does seem to be evidence that we do have a direct relationship with the external world.
And I can certainly vouch for you and your relationship with the archons, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I bring them into existence. They are my creation, I think, in many, many ways. And they are in my own way, my own egregorials. And I think the thing is as well, from quantum mechanics, the central point of the Copenhagen interpretation is that the act of observation or the act of measurement actually creates a subatomic particle. It doesn't exist before it's observed or measured. It's just a statistical wave that the particle will be found in one location or another. And it's only the act of measurement or observation that makes it turn into a point particle. Now, if the whole of reality, which it is made up of these quarks and electrons, which effectively is everything that there is in fields, we effectively are collapsing the wave function of the reality that we perceive as we look out there. We are co-creating the world. This is not new. John Wheeler was arguing this years ago. In fact, John Archibald Wheeler came up with a thought experiment to prove that we not only create the world we're living in now by our observation, but how it was billions of years ago. When we look at a quasar, we're creating that quasar. So it's when we start to realize that consciousness is prime. Consciousness is what everything is. Consciousness is the information field, I believe. And we float upon it in some way. And of course, the perennial philosophy of Aldous Huxley, this is what Huxley argued many, many years ago. It's what Henri Bergson was arguing before then. And science is now becoming, as I think it was Sir Julian Jaynes, very close to you in terms of name again, turned around and he said, the more I discover science, the more I discover the universe, the more I think it's not a great machine, but a great thought. And I think that's a very wise statement.
Does anyone else have any questions for Tony? Please feel free to unmute yourself or put them in the chat box. So you're working on your new book at the moment, aren't you? When is that going to be published, Tony?
Right. My publishers want me to submit the completed manuscript in March, end of March this year, and it should then be in the bookshops in the United Kingdom, Europe, and North America, probably in February or March of 2025. But at the moment, my word count is now at around 320,000 words of notes I've got, and I have to reduce this down to a book of around about 80 to 90,000 words. But it's going to be a complete review. I'm calling it provisionally the near-death experience, the whole story, because I'll be doing everything from the anthropology to the sociology to the science to the history of the near-death experience. I've read at the moment, at the last count, I've read, I think, 230 academic papers on the subject. I'm giving myself a chance to read every single academic paper that's been written on the subject for the last 50 years. Indeed, today I've been writing up sections on near-death experiences within Islamic society, which is very intriguing, very, very interesting stuff. And I've also come across some fascinating near-death experiences that have been described within Japanese Buddhism, which again is extraordinary, that I don't think many people are aware of. It's very interesting in terms of the cultural biases of these things as well. But I'm very excited about this book, and I genuinely believe it probably will be my last one that I will write. So I want to make it my swan song, as it were.
Nice. Harry asks, are you in touch with your daemon?
Yes, I am, and she's a she. And my daemon has been guiding me ever since I started doing the writing. I cite many examples of how this has occurred, how I find books when I need them, how I literally, when I'm writing a book, I follow my daemon. She will point me in a certain direction, I just go with it. And the extraordinary thing is, when I start writing a book, I think, how the hell am I going to write this book? Where's it going to come from? And then 6 months later, I have a book, and I sit back and I go, how the hell did that happen? Things are given to me when I need them. And I think the outcome has always been interesting as to why, at my great age, why did I not write these books when I was much younger? And I always argue, or my daemon hints at the fact that because you couldn't, because people wouldn't be ready for it. People wouldn't understand the analogy, for instance, of the third-person computer game or virtual reality. 40 years ago, people wouldn't have understood those concepts, whereas now they do, and they're ready for them.
And we had Gregory Shushan and Pascal on yesterday, and I asked Gregory if there was anything that he was doing in his life now to prepare for what he thinks may occur at the point of death. Is there anything that you're doing now to prepare yourself for what you anticipate might occur when eventually you do die?
Yeah, it's interesting that I very much are of the same thought patterns as Peter Ouspensky. As I mentioned, Peter Ouspensky earlier on, he was a comparatively famous Russian philosopher, worked with Gurdjieff and fell out with Gurdjieff many years ago. But his writings are very, very interesting. But he, like me, believed in the eternal recurrence and the eternal return, or evidence for. And he spent, according to Gary Lachman, who wrote an incredible biography of him, well worth checking out. And of course, Gary's involved in this as well, isn't it? So check out Gary's work on Ouspensky. And Ouspensky spent the last 6 months of his life, because he knew he was dying, traveling around, because he lived in England at the time, even though he was Russian, traveling around trying to remember, to evoke memories of his past life so he could remember them when he started living it again. Now, because I've had extraordinary deja vus for most of my life, I am sure that I have lived this life before, and I'm sure that when I live it again, I will do it slightly differently. I don't know what I will do or how I will do it, but I just have to listen to my daemon. My daemon has explored this route of being a writer and doing all the things I've done in my life. And the next time round, I know my daemon's going to say, okay, right, let's do something completely different. Or it could be follow a different path within your present life and just see how that comes out. So I'm very excited. I'm looking forward to it. And I would like to believe that each iteration within the Bohemian IMAX, as I call it, the reliving, is that you become more unified with your daemon, and your daemon becomes more and more imminent in your life, till at the end you effectively become a unitary being again. You become your daemon, and then you can live your life in great fun, because then you can explore all the avenues because you know what you're doing, which I think would be quite wonderful.
Yeah, we discussed that yesterday. I mean, it's interesting that you brought up that you brought up this idea about, and I think a lot of people share this idea of like, why couldn't I have done this 10 years ago? Why couldn't I have done this 20 years ago? Because, as you're getting older, you do feel like, oh, I wish I had enjoyed myself more when I was 19, 20, or been more aware then. But it seems to be impossible. And the process of living is kind of simultaneously this process of remembering and revealing and getting closer to the sort of truth of your reality in the world, I think. So it's really interesting to think about, and especially something that comes a lot as you do get older, this idea of getting closer to an awareness of what's really going on. I mean, I often look back on my teenage years and 20s and think, God, how did I do that? How was I so clueless about everything? But unfortunately, we have to live it all again. Harry also said, how does your daemon manifest? Does she manifest as a voice in your head or thoughts?
An inkling, literally using the term quite precisely, because that's what an inkling is. It's a guide, it's a kind of a something you just feel. It's a feeling. I can't describe it more than that. It's just a feeling that something feels right or feels wrong, or it's a recognition of a set of circumstances. And I'd argue that it's possibly leakage across the corpus callosum between the dominant and non-dominant hemispheres of the brain. But that's how it works for me. And one of the points, again, taking the point you were making there, Sarah, is that this one of the points that I make very much in my talks is that, there's the concept of to learn from one's mistakes. Now, if we only have one linear life and we are then reborn, we either go to heaven or we are reborn, reincarnated, or whatever. And again, in my hypothesis, I have a model whereby I can justify reincarnation and past lives, because it's a tuning into the Akashic field of the Akashic record. When you have a past life recollection, you're not necessarily remembering being you. You're coming into what I call the memory of the Uberdaemon, which is the collective unconscious, which is rather similar to the Jungian collective unconscious. But the argument is, you get to older and you have all this wisdom and all these things that and of course you're older, which means that you don't have the physical abilities to do the things you could have done when you were younger. And it seems to be the tragedy of life. But cheating the ferryman suggests otherwise. Cheating the ferryman suggests that all the wisdom that you amass in your life is then carried forward by your daemon and used to guide you when you're a teenager or when you're awkward and when you're in your 20s. That daemon has got more information from the last life, and every life, just like Connor's does in Groundhog Day, every day he learns more. Every day he is better. He understands his life more. He starts to learn things. This is how it works, I genuinely believe. And it's an iteration of life after life after life until you become a bodhisattva, until you become a perfect human being. And then, like the character in the J.B. Priestley play I Have Been Here Before, or Ortis, no, it's I used to remember his name, I've forgotten it now, but the character who is living his life again, he goes back to help people. He's almost like a spiritual rescue person. He's going back to stop people making the mistakes they made last time round. And that's what you do. You go back from there. I mean, I noticed Mary Beth has asked, could it be that the prodigies are people who remember their past life in some capacity? Interesting. I've written a whole series of books on what I call the Huxleyan spectrum. And in the Huxleyan spectrum, I discuss savant syndrome, and I discover and I argue exactly why savants work the way they do. And yes, spot on. You've hit the nail on the head there. That's exactly what is taking place. Their abilities to attune into the greater knowledge base. Like, for instance, my virtual namesake, Peake, the Rain Man. I mean, effectively, he remembered every single thing that occurred in his life. And of course, Sarah, we've met somebody who remembers most of her life. And indeed, if anybody's interested, check out on my YouTube site for a section where this young lady, an Australian, Rebecca Sharrock, Sarah and I tested her live on radio on our interview, and Sarah picked at random a place in one of the Harry Potter novels, and Sarah only read the first 3 words, and it was amazing, wasn't it, Sarah? She immediately then, in her head, said the whole paragraph, and she didn't know we were going to get doing that. That is how the daemon works.
Well, it was amazing to me as well. I mean, one of the reasons why I was so excited about interviewing Rebecca Sharrock. So Rebecca Sharrock is a woman who has highly superior autobiographical memory. And it's a condition that only, I think, around 80 people have been tested in the entire world for it. But it means that she remembers everything. She's also synesthetic and on the autistic spectrum. So that's very interesting as well, because the way she thinks is very different. It seems to be that her memories are really sort of deeply interconnected and engaged in like novel brain regions, perhaps something like that. Because when she was talking about recall, she was talking about how there's almost like a color coding system in her head, so she can access memories via all sorts of sensory impressions that are not just perhaps like the visual recall or the emotional recall that we might have. And she can remember being in the womb, she thinks. But one of the most interesting things for me was the fact that, because I'm so interested in dreaming, when I found out we would be interviewing her, I thought, well, this must mean that all of her dreams are lucid, because for me, being lucid means remembering who and where you are. So if you had this highly superior autobiographical memory, then the chances are you would remember that you're dreaming every time you're dreaming. And she does. So every single dream is lucid. And one of the questions that I put to her, because I can remember dreams from being maybe a toddler that were all white, and then as I got older, certain extra features started to come in until this entire kind of dream world was built up. And she says that she remembers being in a white space as well, and slowly developing things like toys and characters and animals. So that was fascinating and really validating for me to talk to Rebecca about highly superior autobiographical memory. That was one of my favorite guests that we've had.
It was very good. And one of the people I've written about in the past is Sorelin Sherivanevsky, who worked with Alexander Luria. And he remembered literally everything in his life. And it's extraordinary because reading his work, I'm pretty damn sure he experienced temporal lobe epilepsy for a start off, and a lot of these people do. And also dualism, because he actually turned around and said that he was 2 people. And of course, what I think is happening here is people who have an ability to acquire the thought patterns and the memories of the daemon. In other words, they can communicate with their demonic consciousness. That's what is taking place. And in my Huxleyan spectrum, again, I do the neurology, the neurochemistry of how this takes place in my book, Opening the Doors of Perception. And it's fascinating and it's intriguing. There are so many elements to my work and so many factors and so many paths. In many ways, it's almost like my idea, you can follow any path you want. And it's very much the case. I think that we all follow our muse. We all follow our daemon, because our daemon wants to know more about life.
Mary asked, what led you on this path in the first instance? What inspired you to begin writing about these subjects?
My daemon has been preparing me to write the books since at least I was 12 years of age. And looking back over my life now, I find books I bought 50 years ago on chance and by a whim. And I go to them and I find the information I need. I mean, in one of my books, I use the example, and this is an extraordinary piece of demonic power. Way back in probably about 1994, I was in Greece, as I am every year mostly, and I was on the Greek island of Symi, and I was reading The Blind Watchmaker by Richard Dawkins. And one thing I never do is dog-ear web pages. I never do it. It's something I hate doing. You go through my book collection, you'll find none of them except this one. And I was on the beach and I decided I was going to go for tea or for coffee or something. And I don't recall doing it, but I must have dog-eared the page, or my daemon did. And she did it deliberately. So I went up and I had my coffee and everything else, and then forgot the book, left it in my bookcase. Many roll forward 20 odd years. I'm doing research into mitochondria and mitochondrial DNA for my first book. And I think to myself, I need to know more about mitochondrial DNA. Who's going to likely to write about it? Now I have thousands of books. So I went to my book collection. I thought, yeah, Richard Dawkins, he's a biologist, he'll know about it. So I went and I felt my hand going towards the blind watchmaker. And I took it out and I noticed there was a dog-eared page. And I heard my daemon say, ha ha. I heard that in my head. And I knew, and I opened the page and I read down, and there was a reference to mitochondria, the page I dog-eared years before. Now, not only this, I then checked. It is the only page in any of his books he mentions mitochondria. That is the power of the daemon.
How do you feel you mentioned that your daemon is female. How do you experience that aspect of
It's something that myself and my group have discussed for 2 decades. We've always discussed, what is the dynamic of the daemon. And Myron Dial, who is a great friend of mine, who has powerful temporal lobe epilepsy, has been in contact with his daemon since he was 6 years of age. And his daemon, he's always called her as well. And what I believe is that I think for heterosexual people, I think the daemon will always be the opposite sex. And I think for gay people, probably it will be the same sex. Because a gay friend of mine said, no, I always feel that my daemon is male, which I think is interesting. And I think it's to do again with going back to Jungian psychology. Maybe it's, the dynamic of how the sexes work together. I don't know, but that's what I've always felt. I always felt it's a she. I've always felt that she's my anima to my animus.
Harry asks, why do you think some people are born with the ability to hear the daemon and others need to work hard to get in touch with the higher self?
That's the whole point of the book, Opening the Doors of Perception. It depends on how open your doors of perception are. If your doors of perception are open, and I'm using this term neurologically, the daemon can communicate directly. I mean, the daemon speaks to people like Myron, people with temporal lobe epilepsy. The daemon talks to them regularly. With people like me who are classical migraineurs, the daemon can get through, but it can be garbled sometimes. Then you have neurotypicals and the doors of perception are closed. I've been working on this for quite a few years. I think that autism opens the doors of perception. Alzheimer's most definitely does. Gershwin syndrome does. There are various areas, but check out the book in terms of this. I'm also working on the idea of how to communicate with the daemon. And I've got numerous ideas, and I'm thinking of writing a book with a number of other people of using how to communicate with your daemon. There's a guy called Shifa, who is an American psychiatrist, and he uses glasses with the peripheral vision of either eye blocked out. And he argues that if you do that, you communicate with the daemon directly. The daemon becomes manifest. In times of deep hypnotism, the daemon manifests. It's called the hidden observer. Ernest Hilgard had this concept of the hidden observer, which he discovered when he was using people in deep hypnotism. He considered it to be a completely different personality to the everyday personality. I also, that there is something called the WADA, which effectively cuts off by having sodium amytal put into your carotid artery. It deadens the dominant hemisphere. And there's a friend of mine who has this done, and she said as soon as it happened, as soon as her dominant hemisphere was gone, she was awake, and she said there was somebody else completely. I was somebody else completely different.
Well, that's very interesting with regards to Myron Dial, because he had a near-death experience, didn't he? And he died. And when he came back, he says he was a different person. He was like, his family didn't recognize him. And this daemon was suddenly ever present in his life.
Yeah, it is. It's to do, with how the daemon comes through. As I said, Sharonevsky. I mean, Philip K. Dick argued that, there were two of him. And there's so many famous writers that say, like Rudyard Kipling in my example, you know, this is something that creative people know all the time. And you just wait for the daemon to come and to communicate. But remember, the daemon is playing the long plan. So sometimes the daemon will put you in situations and you think, why the hell is this happening? But you realize that the daemon knows it's 2, 3, 4 steps ahead. It's playing chess. So it needs to get you through this to get you where it wants you to be, because it's done it before. And last time it did that, it didn't work. Now, I'd also argue that what tends to happen with deja vu is, again, you are tuning in across the doors of perception, across the demonic consciousness. And this is why you remember certain things, or you think you've perceived it before. Because it is interesting that the older you get, they've done statistical analysis, and the older you get, the less deja vus you get. And there's a great mystery as to why that happens. And I'd argue there's nothing to do with great mystery. I can answer that. It's because in your previous lives, you always will have memories to the point you died last time. And after that point, your daemon and you both will not have any memories. And although your daemon can still guide you, it doesn't know where it's going because you didn't live that long last time. So say last time you died at 42. At 42, you will not get any deja vus anymore because you don't have any, except if you remember many, many past lives. Until you get older, until you start coming down with Alzheimer's. Then the doors of perception are smashed open again by the amyloid plaques that are destroying the microtubules in the brain. And then that opens up the doors of perception again. And this is why elderly people start having incredible memories of their childhood. It's because they're being prepared to go back. It's called neonatalism. There's a guy called Mike Rensfield, I think, who came up with the idea of neonatalism. And it's evidence, it's proof. The body is going back to being a child, being an infant, being an embryo. That's how old people, when they start to curl over, there are certain reflexes like the Babinski reflex that you only have in infants. It then reoccurs towards the end of life, particularly individuals that have Alzheimer's. I tested it with my own mother as she was in the final stages of Alzheimer's. And yeah, I got the Babinski reflex, which only infants have.
Interesting. Does anyone else have any other questions for Tony?
Right. Well, I think that probably, that was Harry. Yeah. I just answered that one, Harry, but I'll try and answer it now. If we're all repeating our lives over now, how does past lives work? Okay. There are levels, the simulation, the information field depends upon the memories of each level. Now, remember, I mentioned something I call the Uberdaemon. The Uberdaemon contains the memories of every single person that's ever existed. So when you go into particular hypnotic states, you go from not into your demonic consciousness, but into your Uberdemonic consciousness. And because people in hypnotic states are wanting to come across well to the hypnotist and everything else as well, they draw up information from the wider information field. It doesn't mean that they are that person. And I've got a number of friends who are professional regressionist hypnotists, and they are exactly the same opinion I am. This is not you remembering a past life of your own. It's you are tuning into another past life of another human being. So in which case, you can have past lives. And because ultimately we are only one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, these past lives are in effect memories of a version of you, but not the Eidolon. They're memories of the Uberdaemon. And of course, I argue that behind that is something called the Godemon, which is effectively the super consciousness, what you could call God, for want of a better term. But that's how I argue that past lives work. I do not argue that they are evidence of reincarnation.
Well, that's a good note to end it on, I think.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Tony. That was great. Thanks, everyone, for coming. And tomorrow we have Dr. Janet P. Delato, who is going to be leading a dream incubation workshop. So it's a more experiential session tomorrow. and I will be sending the link out for that shortly. So thank you very much for everyone for coming. Thank you so much, Tony, for your time and for
All right.
the presentation and everything. That was great. And I'll speak to you soon. Sorry you're not coming to Greece this year, but maybe next year.
Oh, I'm absolutely, definitely, 100%.
Yeah, maybe we can get Plato's Cave happening again.
Absolutely, I think we should.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Bye.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Bye.